Police officers, what's the most painful arrest you've ever had to make? I was working a Sunday morning shift when dispatch called in a welfare check at a house on Ridgemont Lane. Neighbor reported screaming and a child crying for over an hour. I pulled up and the house looked normal from outside. Clean yard, bikes on the porch, a minivan in the driveway. I knocked and a woman answered. She was put together, calm, smiling. She said, "Officer, I'm so sorry. My son had a tantrum over breakfast. You know how kids are." I asked if I could come in and she hesitated for just a second before stepping aside. The house was spotless, almost too clean, like someone had scrubbed it in a hurry. A boy around 6 was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. He didn't look up when I walked in. I crouched down next to him and said, "Hey buddy, what's your name?" He whispered, "Arlo." I said, "Everything okay this morning, Arlo?" He nodded without lifting his eyes from the bowl. The woman, Denise, stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. Her fingers were squeezing just enough that I could see the pressure, but not enough that anyone else would notice. I stood up and looked around. Everything checked out on the surface. I told Denise to have a good day and walked back to my cruiser. I sat there for 2 minutes and couldn't start the engine. Something was wrong. The boy didn't look at me once. Not once. Every kid I've ever met on a welfare check either stares at the uniform or asks about the badge. This kid made himself invisible. I called my partner, Wes, and asked him to run the address. He called back and said no prior reports, no history, nothing. He said, probably just a tantrum like she said. I drove around the block and parked where I could still see the house. 30 minutes later, a man pulled into the driveway. Tall, well-dressed, carrying a grocery bag. He walked inside and the front door closed. I almost drove away. Then I saw the upstairs curtain move. Arlo was standing in the window, pressing both palms flat against the glass, looking directly at my cruiser. I got out of the car and walked back to the front door. The man answered this time. He smiled wide and said, "Can I help you, officer?" I said I was following up on the earlier call. He said, "Oh, that, kids being kids. I'm his father, Ridley. Come in, come in." He was charming. Offered me coffee. Called Denise into the room, and they stood side by side like a catalog photo. I said I wanted to speak to Arlo alone. Ridley's smile held, but his eyes changed. That's really not necessary. He's a shy kid, and strangers make him anxious. I said, "It's standard procedure." Denise touched Ridley's arm softly, the same way she'd gripped Arlo's shoulder. "Let the officer do his job, honey." They led me to Arlo's room. Toys everywhere. Posters on the walls. A perfect child's bedroom. I sat on the floor next to Arlo, and his parents stood in the doorway. I said, "Can I talk to him alone?" Ridley said, "We'd prefer to stay." I looked at Arlo. His eyes were locked on his father. Not the way a child looks at a parent, the way a deer looks at headlights. I said, "Arlo, I'm gonna ask you something, and I want you to answer just for me. Can you pull up your sleeves?" Denise made a sound like all the air left her body at once. Ridley stepped forward and said, "This is harassment. I want your badge number." I didn't break eye contact with Arlo. "It's okay, buddy. You can show me." Arlo looked at his father, then at his mother. Then he slowly rolled up his left sleeve. Bruises ran from his wrist to his elbow in a pattern that doesn't come from falling off bikes or roughhousing. Finger marks, layered. Some yellow, some purple, some fresh. Denise started crying immediately. "He bruises easily. He has a condition. Our pediatrician can confirm." Ridley put his arm around her. "This is a medical issue, officer. You're scaring our son." I said, "Arlo, can you show me your other arm?" He rolled up the right sleeve. Same pattern, same finger width spacing. I said, "Arlo, who did this?" He didn't say a word. He just pointed, not at Ridley, at Denise. The room went silent. Ridley's arm dropped from around her like he'd touched something hot. Denise's crying stopped instantly, like a switch flipped. She looked at Arlo with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't guilt or fear or sadness. It was anger. Anger that he pointed. I cuffed Denise in that room while Arlo watched. She didn't resist. She didn't say a word. She just stared at her son with that same cold expression all the way out the front door. Ridley collapsed onto the kitchen floor. He kept saying, "I work doubles. I'm never home." I didn't know. Child services found marks on Arlo's back and legs that were weeks old. Some were months old. Denise had been hurting him every time Ridley left for work. She got 4 years. I still check on Arlo.